Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us.
So here is the Trump administration saying that they are now going to end temporary protected status, abolish it, and send people back to El Salvador. Obviously, some people have been living in the United States since the early 1980s. Just people have lives here. They have homes, they have families, kids have grown up. All the rest of these things have happened here. So, Trump is saying, we're going to just uproot you and we're going to send you back to El Salvador. This is sort of piling injustice on top of injustice.
That's the voice of author David Bacon, and this week's show we speak to David Bacon about new immigration policies under Trump and how we as a society should respond. Stay tuned. Co-producer Sylvia Richardson here. Latin Waves has been on a bit of a hiatus over the last few months. We've had a lot of family crisis, medical crisis, and that has been overwhelming for us, and the show has kind of taken a back burner. And now that things are kind of in the clear, we're back, and we're happy to be back. Enjoy the show.
His name is David Bacon. He's a California-based writer and photographer. He is a factory worker and a union organizer for 2 decades with the Union Farm Workers. He has been documenting the lives of farm workers through photographs and journalism since 1988. His latest book, In the Fields of the North, En los Campos del Norte, co-published by the University of California. He is a favorite guest of Latin Waves, and we're very privileged to have him. Thank you so much for joining us today, David.
It's a pleasure, as always, to be with you, Sylvia.
Now, you have been not just photographing, but also documenting the lives of indocumentados, of the undocumented, the lives of people who live in the margins, in the shadows of society, and yet are the backbone of the economy. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences in their lives? How do we reconcile, our society having such a number of people without any kind of visibility, any kind of protection?
It's interesting, Sylvia, because I was a union organizer for a long time, and most of the work that I did involved helping workers form their unions, which usually meant going to war with their employers, with their bosses, in factories and fields and other work sites where a lot and oftentimes most and sometimes even everybody was undocumented. And that gave me the understanding that undocumented people are certainly vulnerable because of their immigration status, but they are not passive. People, if given the opportunity, I think it's like people everywhere, if given the opportunity to try to change their situation and try and improve like their working conditions or raise their wages or fight against injustice, people will do that. And in fact, when you look at the history of unions like the United Farm Workers in the U.S., or the organizing even that's gone on, say, in the nurseries in the fields in British Columbia or in Ontario, you see that this organizing work is being done, or this work of fighting against injustice is being done by immigrants and by people who are often in very vulnerable situations, whether it's being an undocumented worker here in the United States, or somebody who's in the Special Agricultural Workers Program in Canada, in other words, a guest worker. People are vulnerable because of their immigration status, for sure. So if you're undocumented in the U.S., what that means is that you can get picked up and deported very easily. In fact, if you get your boss angry at you, that's always something that you have to worry about. And the same thing if you are a guest worker working in a nursery in BC. If you begin organizing and protesting, the possibility exists that the person that you're working for, the company that you're working for, is going to fire you. And when you get fired, of course, you have to leave. You can't. Your visa is conditioned on your employment. And if you lose your employment, then you have to go. And not only that, you also usually get blacklisted for the following season. You can't go back to work for the same place because the company that brought you in the first place won't hire you again. These are ways in which people's immigration status or lack of immigration status makes people vulnerable. It makes it more risky to organize. For any worker in the U.S. or Canada, to organize a union is a risk because you can be fired, even though the laws say that this shouldn't happen. It says it's illegal. We all know that it does happen. And so everybody thinks about that. In fact, that's usually the first thing that you think about when you think about organizing a union. On the one hand, you're angry about the conditions that you want to change. On the other hand, you think about, well, what do I have to lose here? And what's going to happen to me if I try to do that? And that's true for all workers. But if you are an immigrant worker without papers, or if you are a guest worker, you also have to think about the danger of deportation and what that means. And that can be very, very serious because it's not just the humiliation of being deported and having to leave and getting caught up in that system. Oftentimes, people, when they come to the U.S. or Canada to work, it's very costly to do that. These days to cross the border between Mexico and the U.S., if you're being brought across by a guide or a coyote, that costs $5,000 or $6,000 easily. And the cost of paying for the recruitment into the guest worker program is also a lot of money. And so people at home in their hometowns in Mexico or Guatemala or wherever people are coming from, they mortgage their homes, they mortgage their farms, they borrow money from their friends. And so if you get deported, that means that you lose your ability to pay back those debts. And that can have some pretty disastrous consequences for people. So, this really kind of like ups the ante, I guess you would say. And I think that what that means to me is that you can see the courage that people have when faced with these risks and faced with these problems. People organize themselves and they fight for justice anyway. Right now, in Bellingham, right south of the border there's a woman, Maru Moraviepando. Maru is an undocumented immigrant from Mexico who's been living in Washington State for a long time, 20 years, I think at least. Her daughter Jennifer, who's now in college in Bellingham, was born here in the United States. And Maru has been an immigrant rights activist in the U.S. for almost all of those years. In fact, Maru organized the vigils, the hunger strikes, the encampments outside the detention center in Tacoma, south of Seattle, where literally thousands of people have been imprisoned solely because of their immigration status. And Maru really organized it and sort of shone the spotlight of publicity and public pressure and the pressure of these mass demonstrations on this center. She even helped the people who were inside the detention center itself to protest and organize. They were doing all of the work inside this detention center. They cooked the meals, they made the beds, they cleaned the floors, for which they were not getting paid. So this was sort of like slave labor on top of being in the detention center. And Maru organized all of these protests. And then in December, by no coincidence whatsoever, the Department of Homeland Security, Trump's government, sent Maru a notice saying, we are calling you in to ICE to show us what kind of immigration status you have here. And the threat obviously is that if Maru goes in, that they're going to hold her for deportation and they're going to deport her back to Mexico. And that is strictly retaliation against her for all of the work that she's done. And yet, Did that stop Maru from doing it? No, it didn't. In fact, I think, made her even more active, and the people around her active in defending her. So I just have an enormous amount of admiration for her and for the people who stand up and who fight for justice, despite the fact that their immigration status makes this something that's very risky for them to do.
When we look at the present situation with the election of President Trump, for many people, there's sort of a disillusion and just kind of letting go, right? But every time we look away, something else is happening. And so let's talk a little bit about this, because a lot of the times we blame the people who are being most impacted. So we blame the immigrants. Why do they come anyways? Why do they, why don't they just stay in their homes and farm their farms? And here, I think we need to talk a little bit about the way that power has co-created structures that impoverish people, even in their own lands. So in the case of Salvadorian immigrants, most of Salvadorians, most of us left because a U.S. intervention in El Salvador, of U.S. support for a dictatorship that was killing people, more than $1 billion spent in supporting a war. And you see the effects of that. We used to joke that most Salvadorians lived outside El Salvador. Clearly, that's not the case, but many were forced, and many finds themselves working in factories. So can we talk a little bit about the impact of so-called trade agreements like the NAFTA in promoting this kind of migration? Because for us, it's migration.
Well, in the case of El Salvador, what we had was the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which was patterned after the North American Free Trade Agreement, the one that the U.S. and Canada negotiated with Mexico, and then CAFTA kind of extended that into Central America. But going back in history, even before that agreement, you mentioned, Sylvia, that the first really big wave of migration from El Salvador in modern history came as a result of the war. And so let's think about what was going on in the war in El Salvador. El Salvador was a U.S. neo-colony, let's call it that. In other words, the United States controlled the economy of El Salvador for the purpose of enriching U.S. investors who had money invested in El Salvador, and the rich Salvadorans who kind of made their money in cooperation with the U.S. And those two groups together, they ran the government of El Salvador. El Salvador was a dictatorship because of that, because they needed that kind of political control to kind of keep in place this very unjust system that was impoverishing most people for the benefit of a tiny few. I have a friend, Ana Martinez, who we were organizers together in Los Angeles for the United Electrical Workers in the 1990s, in the early 90s. And Ana, I first met actually when she came to the United States in 1979, I think, 1979 or 1980. And Ana had been a worker in the Texas Instruments plant in Ilopango, right outside of San Salvador. And in that plant, which was obviously a factory owned by this huge U.S. corporation, Texas Instruments, and the reason why it was in El Salvador to begin with was in order to take advantage of the low wages in El Salvador, which TI was then using. It hired people, put them to work on these production lines to assemble electronic equipment that in turn turned around and sold in the U.S. So the low wages of the workers in this plant were a source of enormous profits for this company. Well, I think it was in 1979, there was a general strike that was organized by workers all across El Salvador. And Ana was part of a group of workers who were trying to organize a union in this plant and who wanted to participate in this general strike. And so on the day of the strike, she remembered that she kind of was waiting for the word, not knowing quite what was going to happen, how she was going to get the workers to stop. And when the time came, a couple of workers came over from the unionized printing plant next door and told her that the strike was on. And so she went over to the button that stopped the machines and stopped the production line, and she pressed the button. And she said that the security guards of Texas Instruments and the local police then began walking up and down the lines with their guns out, threatening the workers. They took those two guys who had come over from the printing plant next door, and they took them outside in front of the factory, the TI factory, and they shot them and killed them. And then the workers from the TI plant, they went down to their union office in town, and the guards and the police followed them down, and they shot up the union office and killed more people. And that was when Ana came to the United States, because she was basically fleeing for her life. So this is what El Salvador was like, and this is why people organized that civil war, that guerrilla war, in order to change this kind of social order. And what happened was that the United States government and the Reagan administration then armed the Salvadoran government to the teeth. It trained death squads. And these death squads were basically military people who were trained at the School of the Americas, who then turned around and trained their guns on Salvadorans. They assassinated Archbishop Romero. They assassinated U.S. nuns in their home in El Salvador. And people fought that war for years then in order to try to stop this kind of terror. And as a result of that, about 2 million people came from El Salvador to the United States and to Canada. So that's where that migration came from. And TPS in the United States, temporary protected status, was a status that was fought for by the immigrant rights movement in the United States in order to protect those people who had come from El Salvador from being deported back to El Salvador. And then the U.S. negotiated a trade agreement to make it even easier for big corporations to invest in El Salvador. People went into the streets in El Salvador to try to stop that agreement. More people got killed in the process. More people came. And so here is the Trump administration saying that they are now going to end temporary protected status, abolish it, and send people back to El Salvador. Obviously, some people have been living in the United States since the early 1980s. People have lives here. They have homes, they have families, kids have grown up. All the rest of these things have happened here. So, Trump is saying, we're going to just uproot you and we're going to send you back to El Salvador. This is sort of piling injustice on top of injustice. Yeah. Because, the whole reason why people are here to begin with is because of what the United States did in El Salvador. And now here Trump is coming and saying, well, we're not even going to look at the history. We're not responsible for anything. If you're Salvadoran, get out. I think it's a scandal. It's a shame and a scandal.
They say that time heals all wounds. I say that time conceals all wounds. So can we talk about the ramifications that this will have, not just on Salvadorian lives? We know there will be impacted. We know that they will be deeply uprooted, and many lives will be distraught. I'm sure Salvadorians were survivors, and people will find ways to survive. Some will not. That's just what happens when injustice is allowed to go rampant. But can we talk about the weavings that we are co-creating, because this is not an impact just for Salvadorans. This is also an attack on labor in North America, an attack on the fabric of what it means to be part of a society. These are people who are part of your community. These are people who are your neighbors. These are people who go to school with your children.
The whole policy, first of all, of mass deportations is destroying families and communities. And we're talking here about Salvadorans, but this is also Trump just did the same thing for people coming from Haiti, and Haiti is another example of a country in which U.S. intervention and U.S. actions towards Haiti is large part responsible for the kind of crisis in Haiti that has caused people to come to the U.S. To begin with. But the cost of people's families, the cost of our communities is very, very, very high because, as you say, people are part of our communities here in all kinds of different ways.
We co-create our cultures, and when you allow your government, your neighbor, your cousin, your father, whoever it is, to create these kinds of patterns that further deepen the inequality, the injustice, the suffering, the death, that this will cause to many people, then you're creating a new way of being. So I think globalization is a great thing for many things, in ways that it allows us to connect with others. It also is a way to homogenize injustice. If you think about monopolies of any kind are not at the service of people. And at some point, I think we as the people need to come out of this sleep that if the U.S. deports people, somehow there will be more jobs for the people. Most of the jobs that the Salvadorians are doing are not being done by any other American. Let's be clear about that. Most of the things that immigrants come and do are things that are essential to society and yet are not rewarded, are not even acknowledged. So, can we talk about that co-creation of culture, because I don't think we are going to see a better future ahead creating more devastation, and a lot, and just looking the other way, because when we look the other way we sort of lose a part of ourselves, I think.
Here in the United States, the creation of culture, I think it's a very interesting question because the Salvadorans who came and who have been living here and working here for 30-odd years, more, almost 40 years now, people are part of the Salvadoran workers are part of the U.S. working class. They're not a separate working class all by themselves. They are part of the working class of the United States, and they have the same situation, same problems that workers in general have. Whether it's the insecurity of their jobs, or the low wages, or the no health care, or all the rest of it. Furthermore, people are working, even though it's true that if you look at who the janitors are in the office buildings in Los Angeles, you'll find that most of those workers are Salvadorans. And if you go out into the fields in California, you'll find that most of the workers out there are Mexicans. So we do have a workforce in which that is kind of stratified or almost segregated in some ways. The reality, though, I think, is that for many, many, many people are working together with other people and living in communities with other people. It's true that we have segregation. It's true that we have neighborhoods that are segregated according to race and according to nationality. But it is also true that in the U.S. and in Canada, we are all, in the end, living together, and we are all, in the end, working together. So we are sort of creating a common working class culture here in both countries, in which people are contributing the languages and the culture and the traditions and the dances and the music and the food and the traditions of social protest that people have brought with them. And it is changing the culture that people have found when they get here. And then we create something that is new and that is enormous problems of social injustice, but it is, in some ways, I think, it is our creation. The working class culture of our two countries is our creation as working people. And what we are also trying to do is to get rid of those parts of the legacy of the past, the inequality, the slavery, the pogroms, all the rest of it, so that we can kind of flower as people. And that, I think, is one of the worst aspects of what Trump is doing, but let's be honest, Obama too, the mass deportations and treating parts of our population and saying, well, you don't belong here. You should be somewhere else. You're not part of this community. You're trying to sort of rip up and rip apart this fabric here. And I think that is something that is enormously painful and also to the detriment of what we are trying to create.
Yes, we have a president that is racist. Yes, we have a president that seems to be ill prepared for political diplomacy or even willing to take into account what responsibility may mean for this office. However, politics has never been about the person in charge. Politics has been about the people on the ground. Politics has always been about what the people want. There is a point where you have to question, when do we make a stand? And as you say, demand the reparation be made, because reparation is due. And in the very least, at the very least, I think we as a society who live in the U.S., who are documented, have a responsibility to stand up and protect those who are made vulnerable by, this horrible, terribly unjust policies that are being put in place. I want to end our interview on a high note and point out that as an activist, you're also a beautiful artist. And David Bacon, as a photographer, has written. He has an exposition of his latest, of his book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Sylvia, thank you. Also, well, the latest book is called In the Fields of the North, or En los Campos del Norte, and it is a book of 302 photographs and about a dozen oral histories of people who are farm workers in the U.S., mostly in California, but some other areas as well, too. And they document people working, what their work is like, what people's communities are like, how people live and their living conditions, the culture that people bring with them. And it's also completely bilingual in English and Spanish. In fact, it's published simultaneously in the United States by University of California Press and in Mexico by the Colegio de la Frontera Norte. So this is an effort to sort of take a look at who the people are who are responsible for putting food on the table for us.
Thank you so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Sylvia, as always.
Take care.
We've come to the end of our show, Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an internationally syndicated weekly program made available through campus and community stations and available out to the world at www.latinwavesmedia.com. Visit Latin Waves Media to hear previous shows, to access resources, or support our efforts towards social change via community project engagement. Thank you and bye for now.